Let's get started. Hello, everyone. We are already about 40. Some people are still entering. Very excited I am about this session now called Reimagining Chess with AlphaZero. Everybody knows about AlphaZero, the amazing neural network, machine learning approach that has changed chess and Go and shogi and huge impact. Today we are not talking exactly about the impact of AlphaZero, or we are not hearing from two members of the AlphaZero team about it, but Ullrich, Paquet and Nenad Tomasev are with us to talk more specifically about a project that they have done, a follow-up project, you could say. I'm very excited about this because it has to do with possible future of chess beyond the type of chess that we are playing currently, which is infested with theory. Everybody has to learn so much opening theory, and it's a nightmare. I cannot just go to a game anymore and simply enjoy. No, my opponent will be prepared in general with knowledge and with specific knowledge about me. But Ullrich and Nenad together, actually, I think they will share this with Vladimir Kramnik and Demis Hassabis and the others from the team have looked at chess variants and what AlphaZero can do about this. I'm very, very excited about this. Please, Ullrich, I think you're going first.
Yes, thank you, everyone. It's wonderful to speak to all of you today. If you can all hear me, that would be that's good. We've got an hour, so I'm going to share slides, and I'm going to take the first 15 or so minutes to demystify AlphaZero and just really explain what it is and how it works. And then I'm going to hand over Nenad, who's going to explain some of the new work on chess variants. And then I think we'll have a discussion on the practical applications and to show how it's running on chess.com. So let me try and share a screen with you. And Stefan, maybe if you can just give me a thumbs up if you can see this.
Yes, it's cool. Cool.
Okay, fantastic. So the title of our session today is Reimagining Chess with AlphaZero. And the first part I'll talk about is just about AlphaZero and AI and how AI intersects with chess. So my first experiences with artificial intelligence was in a little device that many of you may remember. It was one of these Kasparov Sciatek chess machines. And it was amazing, it was magical, but this was back in the 80s and 90s. And this is the first entry into chess. But everything in this machine was handcrafted. There was someone who hand-coded an evaluation function. There's someone who hand-coded a search algorithm to determine the best moves to play. There's someone who hand-coded exactly what the level structure would be. And I played this little machine in South Africa, and I remember sitting in high school and wishing that I could have been in the room when this event happened. And you all remember this. This is Garry Kasparov against IBM Deep Blue, and it is a big moment in the evaluation of computing and chess engines. But chess and artificial intelligence have a very, very long history. And in a way, chess has always been what we like to call a petri dish for AI, for artificial intelligence. So many of the techniques that we see in artificial intelligence today were incubated on a chessboard. And the reason is that chess is what's called a zero-sum perfect information game. So it's perfect information in that I can apply AI algorithms to a world in which I know everything. I can see all the pieces on the board. It's not as if I'm driving a self-driving car and there's a pedestrian that's going to cross the road in 2 minutes. I have no idea where the pedestrian is going to be. I know where all the pieces are. Nothing's hidden from me. So it's a really nice starting point for any kind of artificial intelligence development. And that's why chess is so crucial to AI still today. And this is a quick history, my history of the ideas and ideals that led to the development of AlphaZero. So AI and chess have a long history. In the 1700s, most of you know the story of the mechanical Turk machine. That is not actually a machine. It was a contraption that hid a human in a little box, and the human with an intricate arrangement of mirrors was hidden so that no one actually knew that there was a real human in the loop. And this toured the grand courts of Europe and impressed everyone, but it was an elaborate hoax. And that then moved to the 1950s and late 1940s with the advent of modern computing. And Claude Shannon, who is the father of modern information theory, wrote a paper in the late 1940s, early 50s called Programming a Computer for Playing Chess. And in this, Claude Shannon postulated that one could represent chess in terms of numbers, in terms of numeric computation. And he explained a number of key concepts that we find in the IBM Deep Blue machine still, for instance, and in AlphaZero. That's the idea of a minimax search, the idea of an evaluation function. And so the foundations were laid. And then 97 was a big year for chess, because that's the point where computers really, and the power of computing really eclipsed human possibilities. And then 2016 happened, and there was another turning point in the history of computing and games, and that's when AlphaGo, DeepMind's neural network Go engine, beat probably the best Go player in history, Lee Sedol. And there's a big difference in the approaches between the 1990s and the 2010s. I found another beautiful paper by Alan Turing, who's one of the other fathers of modern computing. This paper was written in the 1950s, and this comes from the Turing archives. And I just want to read a few sentences. So he says, could one make a machine to play chess in the 1950s? And he postulates a few things. And number 3 in his list is, could one get a chess machine to play reasonably well? That is to make decent legal moves. But then he has a really nice point, number 4, and he says, could one make a machine to play chess? And then Alan Turing's comment is, he says, and to improve its play, game by game, actually profiting from its own experience, the machine's own experience. So in 1953, Alan Turing already had this idea of a self-learning chess system in mind. Actually, if any of you are interested in artificial intelligence, point 5 here is the Turing test. Could one then make a machine to answer questions so that you don't know that the machine's a machine and not a human? And he gives a few answers. He says in the 1950s, Alan Turing says, yes, I think we could make a machine that plays reasonable chess. And then to the point where he asks, could one make a machine that teaches itself how to play really, really good chess? He says, I believe so, but I know of no really convincing argument to support this belief, and I can't disprove it, but I think it can be done. Okay. So AlphaZero does not use any handcrafted rules, and I'd like to call or speak about the way chess engines were built up to the 2000s as the craft of handcrafting. So there are many hand-coded rules, almost if-then-else style rules, and a lot of manual feature extraction. You'd encode a chess position numerically with very, very careful hand design and hand tuning. And AlphaZero presents a different approach. There is absolutely no hand-coded evaluation functions. There's no manual feature extraction. It takes the raw chessboard as an input. And it has 3 components that I'll speak about in the next 5 minutes. The one component is a learning component. The next component is a search component. And the third component is a self-improvement component. And all these things are necessary to create a machine that could learn superhuman chess from absolutely nothing. And I guess most of you know Matthew Sadler and Natasha Reagan's Game Changer book. So let's put these three components into a loop, a learning loop. But just before we do that, we could think of AlphaZero as an engine that sits halfway between top humans and other top chess engines, in the sense that top humans may evaluate hundreds of positions per move. I'm speaking about top humans, not me. Top engines will evaluate millions of positions, and AlphaZero typically tens of thousands of positions before it makes a move. And it does so because it has a really intelligent neural network that proposes and evaluates positions. So AlphaZero is an adaptive, self-improving chess system, and it has parts. The first part is a learning component, where neural networks are trained. The second part is a decision-making part, which uses the neural networks to decide which moves to play. The third one is a part where the world is changed so that it has better games. And then the fourth one is like better data that could be learned on again. So this loop is present in any artificial intelligence system that interacts with and learns from the real world. And in this case, chess is our petri dish. So let's start with learning. Learning number one, learning 101. So imagine I give you a big pile of data, and the data consists of chess games. They don't have to be good chess games. They could be completely random chess games. And the chess games consist of a state called S. And at the end of the game, there's an ultimate game outcome, which you call Z. So Z could be won, drawn, or lost. And from this data, I am going to learn an approximator, a mathematical function that best predicts the game outcome from the data that I see. So AlphaZero has two parts. The one is called a value network. It takes as an input a chess position, and it outputs the expected score from that chess position, given all the data that I've seen so far, all the games that I see. Now, it's really important that this thing should be able to generalize. So generalization in AI just means that I should be able to give it a position that it's never seen before. And it should not do something stupid. It should make very reasonable predictions about who's winning, losing, and drawing, and what the odds are. The second thing that we get in data, except for the final score, is the next move that's played from a move. And AlphaZero has a second neural network that takes in a state, and every state leads to another state. And it would predict the odds of making a move to a next state with no thinking time at all. So without calculation. So there's a second neural network inside AlphaZero, which is called a policy network. And the policy network simply predicts the odds of making every move from a certain position. So in this case, you can see a state S, and it is White's move. And there could be a long range of maybe 32, any number of next moves. And it would output a probability of making a move. And of course, that should sum to 1. And there would be higher weight to more likely moves. The next part is a decision-making component. So if you do have these two neural networks, AlphaZero then does search. And it does search with something called Monte Carlo tree search. And it happens as follows. So a position or root node or state would be expanded with the prior network until you hit some root node in a tree. At that point, you'd get the value, and that would be backed up in this thing called state action function. And this process would be repeated with a very special rule. And the rule is such that eventually all moves would be considered. But it's so that the rule is constructed, it's a little mathematical formula, so that the more promising moves are explored or visited a lot more. So if this process is done a number of times, we'd see that one branch in this tree is statistically visited many more times than any of the other branches. And that is then the move that AlphaZero plays. Now, there's a trade-off between exploration and exploitation here. Exploration means that you do want to try all moves. So if you play this, if you let AlphaZero run infinitely long, it would visit all moves. Exploitation means it visits the most likely moves more frequently. Okay, so finally we pick the branch that has the most visits and we make a move. And that position, because we calculate it, is of a better quality than the original data that we learned the neural network from, because we had a neural network plus search. And that leads to improved data, which then, if we train the network on again, would give a better chess engine, or a better AlphaZero. And then this loop, of course, improves and iterates. Now, I do want to say that AlphaZero and chess is a petri dish for the real world. And this self-improving, self-iterating loop that you could use to build a superhuman chess engine is probably applicable to many, many other areas as well, and many other problems. But the real world is more nuanced. So I'll leave you with the last thought before I hand over to Nenad, who's going to talk about how AlphaZero is used to explore new chess variants and how it's a really nice analysis tool. But the thought is this, that the real world is a lot more nuanced than a chessboard. So if we do want to take the ideas from AlphaZero and apply it to more complicated domains, some extra additions need to be added. My typical example here, if I speak on stage, is imagine AlphaZero is a person who's giving a talk. So there's a learning process, there's a decision-making process, and then there's feedback. So some of you might be fast asleep, some of you might really enjoy the talk, and that is not a win, draw, loss feedback. That's very discrete, like we see in a chess game. It's completely nuanced, and that's a really interesting challenge for artificial intelligence. So with that future view of how we can maybe use chess for more complicated algorithms, I'm going to hand over to Nenad, who's now going to tell you how we used AlphaZero to explore and analyze different chess variants. And the idea is that because AlphaZero could be trained from absolutely no chess knowledge at all, we don't need to hand code any rules. It learns these rules and these evaluations itself. So Nenad, over to you.
Thanks. Should I share my screen instead? I guess it's easier.
Yeah.
Just 1 second. Can everyone see this, or? Yeah, okay, we're good then. Yeah, so thanks, Ullrich, for quite a nice historical introduction. And speaking of history, there is plenty of history in chess. It goes way earlier than any tech related to chess came about. And I mean, as we all know, as a game, chess started, at least it is thought to have started around the 6th century, and has gone through various stages before it actually became the game that we all know, love, and cherish today. Here, as an example, we see one rather ancient drawing of what the pieces looked like in Shatranj, which is one of the original versions of chess. Not the first one, I think, but one of the older ones. And like even in that version, which was played way back, it had very many similarities to the modern game, but it had some notable differences. And some of those differences, for instance, which will become relevant later on in the talk as well, included, for instance, that stalemate was a win in Shatranj. There was no castling. There was some, well, I guess the rooks, the knights and the king moved the same, if I remember correctly, and there was some differences maybe with the bishops and the queen, and there were some special moves in terms of how the queen and the king could move. And some other minor differences in winning conditions, because I believe, again, if I'm not wrong, that another way to win would be to kind of capture the entirety of the opposing army, and if the opponent has no pieces other than the king, I believe this was also considered to be a win. But in many other aspects, it was a game similar to chess as we know it today. From that point onwards, I mean, chess evolved for a considerable amount of time until it became close to the modern game, sometimes in the Middle Ages. And we see records of it in historical pieces of work, like this book of games that has covered chess, backgammon, and some games of chance, so playing with dice. And all of these games were originally popular with nobility in Europe, and they were seen as well, as a petri dish for war rather than a petri dish for AI, in a sense that playing chess was obviously linked to strategy and tactical maneuvers in the battlefield and so on. And from that point onwards, we come to modern times, and obviously in the previous couple of decades, chess has progressed immensely, and chess theory in particular has also progressed immensely. So one event that maybe is worth mentioning, even though I must say this is not the problem under quotation marks that we are trying to address in this piece of work, because this was a very engaging, fun match to watch, the clash between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. But we could see even in that World Championship clash that all of the classical games ended up in a draw. And I mean, to be fair, some of those games, because of the deep preparation that they were doing, they wouldn't, they would leave theory at a reasonably early middle game stage that the games would still remain engaging, right? But there is this overall trend in professional chess, top level professional chess, that I think everyone has been seeing and commenting on, which is that an increasing number of games is ending in a draw, and obviously the technique has improved, the knowledge has improved, so that is normal. But the worry was that there was also an increasing number of games that would end in uneventful draws, where both players would just play out their opening preparation, and then they would be in a kind of trivially for them technically drawn endgame or something like that. And while that is fair, I mean, in terms of all the work that people have been putting in preparation, that in particular isn't maybe as fun to watch, and arguably isn't as fun to play, because it's just rote memorization. Nothing actually happens at the board then. I've actually seen this meme the other day, which I then threw into the deck, which kind of, summarizes what that conceptually looks like when you push it to the extreme, just having two books, two sets of memory playing each other, rather than actually being creative and coming up with new ideas at the board, which is where the joy of playing chess actually comes from, and where the entertainment value is when you're, watching other people play. So, I mean, as for the comment here, I think 20 moves even is not so hard, and not so harsh. And you could argue that chess genuinely hasn't been exhausted in a theoretical sense. There is plenty of juice left in the game, but there is an overall trend, and obviously with time, more and more is known, more and more has been played, explored, analyzed in depth with various strong engines, that a point could come conceivably at some point in the future where the game would kind of become known up to the point where what remains is no longer as exciting as what was before. So we're not there yet by far, I would say. But because of this general trend, it's worth thinking about, if that were to come about, is there anything that we can do, or are there any things that we maybe should as a community be thinking about so as to address this issue? And with that in mind, obviously even Bobby Fischer had his own take on the whole preparation story. So Chess 960, Fischer Random Chess, is the first incarnation of an attempt at addressing this. And I'm not going to go into the details. I'm sure everyone here knows it, in terms of permuting the positions of pieces on the first rank, which just increases the amount of theory to the point where no human can maybe conceivably hold it all or invest the time to go as deep as one would in classical chess. So that's one way of dealing with this. We didn't look in our project at Fischer Random Chess, but we didn't look at it for a reason. This reason is that it's already an adopted chess variant. Many people play it. Many people love it. There have been some online chess events recently with top-level players playing Fischer random chess. So people have already made up their minds as to whether they like it or not. And there is nothing we could add to that conversation, I would say. We could obviously develop an engine for Fischer random chess that might be, interesting, but it's not a question we are trying to answer, if that makes sense. And even with Fischer random chess, some people we've heard occasionally say that they may not like the aesthetic of it as much because the pieces are arranged asymmetrically. So you often have some undefended pawns that get attacked at once, knights that are clashing for the same square that they want to jump to. And you spend a little bit of time trying to enter it to a more classically looking position when you start, which isn't everyone's cup of tea, but obviously for some people it's immensely enjoyable. So we partner up, or rather Vladimir Kramnik partnered up with us because he has initiated this project, and he had this idea that it's something that we may want to start looking at with AlphaZero, it being what it is. And as Ullrich was saying, one big advantage of a system like AlphaZero is that because it requires no prior knowledge of a domain of a game, if we're looking at new chess variants, we could try to make statements about them, analyze them qualitatively and quantitatively without actually knowing anything about their dynamics beforehand, knowing nothing about the openings, nothing about the typical middle game or end game patterns, having some rough ideas, obviously, as people, but essentially not knowing if the theory that emerges in those variants is engaging. Is the game maybe winning from start, or is the draw trivial? And, should people invest time into trying them out, essentially? So we would be prototyping then with AlphaZero what these ideas would look like, and try to come to some conclusions that would inform whether for the entire chess community it is worthwhile maybe trying to play certain variants. And ultimately it's a subjective thing. It's a matter of taste. Different people will have different opinions, but we would essentially hope to save people some time, if they were to try something that doesn't ultimately lead anywhere. So the first thing we've looked at together was this no casting chess. And there were some associated articles. I'm sure most people here will have seen them, where essentially we tried removing casting as an option, all the other rules staying the same. And that led to some, highly entertaining chess. Again, maybe not to everyone's taste, because, it takes a while to evacuate your king if you're kind of worried about your own safety. But this very fact that there are multiple ways of evacuating the king, and it takes more moves to do so, resulted in some highly entertaining attacking and counter-attacking chess. And one thing, I guess, that we were initially worried about was that if you remove the casting option, so if both kings have to be stuck at the center for a while at least, then maybe it wouldn't be as easy for white to attack as well, that maybe the game would be somewhat slow and, quote unquote boring, because you need to secure your king usually when you are attacking. But that turned out not to be the case. So there was plenty of attacking chess there still, maybe even arguably more than classical chess. So that was an interesting discovery, an interesting thing we've shown together. And we recently released this report called Assessing Game Balance with AlphaZero, Exploring Alternative Rule Sets in Chess, where we've looked at a couple of different variants. We've generated lots of games, fast play, slow play games. With AlphaZero, looked at different statistics, sat together with Vladimir. He gave us his opinions on each, and has analyzed different tactical patterns and analyzed games with us. And this paper distills all of that together. So let's look at a couple of ideas we've tried. In terms of no casting, we've tried seeing what happens if neither side can cancel at all. Or one thing that Vladimir was also quite curious about is what if you just restrict that you can't castle for the first X moves, where X can be any number, and we've tried, let's say, 10. And there was also more in terms of theory and it's affecting various opening lines and in different ways, because in chess theory, in classical chess theory, casting occurs at a different move, at different lines. So putting some restrictions on it then changes up the theory, basically. So I think what we've seen from this is that no casting chess was indeed quite rich, quite fun. The partial restriction, the one we've tried for the first 10 moves, wasn't as much, because what would tend to happen, and I mean, this kind of makes sense after the fact, but this is exactly the reason why we were looking at these things with AlphaZero in the first place, was that because castling is such a powerful move, it's such a fast move, it allows you to, move the pieces quickly. What AlphaZero would prefer to do was wait for 10 moves to pass and then castle. Then it thought this was more valuable than giving up on the right to castle at all, because castling is still an option at some point. And then it would play some slower opening systems where the king can be safe for the first 10 moves or so, and then castle on both sides, and then the game would proceed. So this did change the theory, but I guess the result of that was just that it was sub-selecting the parts of chess theory that are less aggressive, less direct, less dynamic. So I think that Vladimir felt in our conversation that wasn't maybe as interesting after all. Another thing we've tried that goes also to one of these historical variants was, what if the pawns could just move by one square, all of the other rules remaining the same? And some of the older versions of chess also had the pawns only be able to move one square, so this is nothing new. And this was also kind of, I guess, surprisingly tactical and entertaining. It's just a much slower game because it takes a longer time for you to, move up all of your pawns forward. But my also view, having looked at many of these games, is that it emphasizes piece play, and it emphasizes flexibility in the pawn structure, because you're moving, let's say e3 and then d3, and then you still have a choice whether you're going to go d4 or e4. Maybe you can go c3 as well first, and there is this game of bluff as to what actual structure you're going to adopt. So it has some pros as well, but obviously it has certain cons if you're, after fast chess. We've tried seeing what happens if stalemate is actually a win. I think this is something that has been discussed in the chess community for a while, and people were curious whether it would make the game substantially more decisive. As will be clear later on when we look at the stats, it did make it more decisive, but maybe not to a degree to which the people were hoping. But what this change affects in particular, it's some types of endgames where, two knights could make the king, or that some king and pawn endgames would go from being drawn to being winning or losing. Another thing we looked at is, okay, so what happens if instead of restricting options, we add new options to increase piece mobility and make chess even faster than it is today? And we've looked at two torpedo, as we've called them, chess options. One being just if the pawns can always move from any position, either by one square or by two squares. And then en passant can also happen anywhere on the board. And this was, well, highly entertaining in the sense that the board would just explode at a certain point. The openings would proceed reasonably normally, but then once there is a bit of space created on the board, the pawns would just start being launched all over. And it changes the end games a lot because, it's much harder to stop a pawn from queening if you have a passed pawn. And similarly, it has lots of attacking options because you can play h4, h6, you can play g3, g5, and so on. And we look at the partial version of that, which is somewhere in between. It increases mobility a little bit, but not to that kind of an insane point, which added the option of moving the pawns from the third rank to the fifth, and from the fourth to from the sixth to the fourth, right? So instead of just being from the second rank that you can move by two squares, now there were two options instead of one. Another thing we've looked at is what if you can move your pawns backwards. I guess this is one of these famous quotes in chess where the pawns cannot move backwards, in a sense that you shouldn't be moving forwards recklessly because you're leaving space behind and you can't plug those weaknesses after. But in the pawn backwards chess, you actually can. So what tends to happen is you can be maybe more aggressive in grabbing space and not worry too much. I mean, it still needs to be technically justified about some holes you've created, because you can move the pawn back to attack the squares later on in the game. And the same goes for the cover, in front of the king. If you play g3 or h3, you can play g2 or h2 after. So it's harder to provoke weaknesses in front of the king. An interesting variant. yet another thing we looked at in terms of pawn mobility was what if the pawns could move sideways. Now this is a bit different, it's a bit alien, it's a bit funky, but actually also highly entertaining with some very cool patterns. Like here, for instance, in the pattern that's currently on the slide, there was a sacrifice on f2, and now black would play f7, e7, attacking the knight and opening the file of the rook against the king for a discovered check when the knight on the f6 square moves, right? So it added lots of interesting tactical patterns and still quite entertaining games. And finally, a thing we looked at was what if you could capture your own pieces instead of just your opponent's pieces? And here on the board, there is one example where the rook on h1 captures the pawn on h4, kind of, well, also defending on the fourth rank, right, but also opening files against the black king. And it turns out that in quite a few cases, this can be a good idea, giving this ability, even though it's quite a big sacrifice because you've spent a tempo to lose material, which is more than what normally happens in sacrifices where your opponent has to spend time capturing something for you to gain something in return. So that's another interesting variant. When we've looked at this quantitatively, just to put some numbers on this, and I promise I will speed up because I have a lot more ground to cover, maybe not as much time. So it turns out that some of these variants are actually substantially more decisive than classical chess. Torpedo chess in particular, so where the pawns can always move by 1 or 2 squares, was the most decisive of them all, and similarly gives the highest white advantage. Note that these numbers, so the draw, win, and loss numbers, they depend on the elo of the entity playing. So here we have two sides of the plot where AlphaZero plays either with 1 second per move or with 1 minute per move. You see that there are obviously many more draws. AlphaZero is quite strong at 1 minute per move. And obviously, if you keep increasing the time, eventually everything becomes a draw. So all of these games are theoretically drawn, probably, if we are to trust AlphaZero. The same as is, I guess, suspected of classical chess. But if you think about what these percentages would look like for human players, which I think, as far as my understanding of AlphaZero elo goes, are probably will probably win or lose even more games than what is on this 1 second per move side of the plot. And you see some increase in the decisiveness of stalemate equals win, semi-torpedo, self-capture even, and so on. These differences in win and loss rate are actually opening specific. They're specific to certain lines and position types. So, you know, this comes from AlphaZero best play from the starting position. But we also tried looking at some particular opening systems. And you see that, for instance, as far as the Dutch defense goes, the ability to move your pawns backwards helps with defense, which is sort of unsurprising, given the feelings that people have about it. Similar with pawns sideways, because you can again plug those holes more easily. As far as the triggering defense goes, actually, this is from 1 second per move. When you go to 1 minute per move, white wins always, as AlphaZero, as white wins always. In a very strange fashion, because it's just a long strategic bind. It's not a tactical shot from the beginning. I don't think Berlin defense needs an introduction in this crowd. I think we're all familiar with it and with the importance it has had in modern chess theory, but also its prominence in professional play when people really need to play something solid and really are content with the draw and need the draw. Right? So it's interesting to see that AlphaZero agrees in classical chess. I won't go into the details as to how all of this is computed, but one thing, how to interpret these plots basically is that classical chess is in the blue and for e4 and in the orange for knight f3 on the left, and on the right you see the no castling chess variant. Similarly, either the e4 opening systems or the knight f3 opening systems. And the fact that blue is on the left-hand side to the right to knight f3 in classical chess, so e4 is kind of moved to the left, shifted to the left, means that the number of available options is lower. There is less flexibility. The lines are more forcing. So this is the way to read this plot. And there will be similar plots coming later on. And the spike you see on the far left as the most likely line of play for AlphaZero under E4 systems is this particular line of Berlin defense. So it really, really loves utilizing Berlin defense over anything else when E4 or E4, E5 is played. Whereas for knight F3, again, in AlphaZero's mind, there is many more options that it finds promising and interesting. So it's an interesting thing to be thinking about, because if there is a singular response to a move that you can just study and never get into trouble and just, you know, survive, then you don't need to study the rest of the theory, and the rest of the theory sort of, unless you're curious about it, becomes less relevant on the black side. But we see that in no-castling chess, this is not an issue, not a thing. There isn't a single prominent line, there isn't a single prominent peak, which means that in no-castling chess, AlphaZero finds both knight F3 and E4 as first opening moves for white to be equally flexible, equally rich, with no single line solving black's problems in either. So there is a distinction between the two in that sense. Here we see just a different way of looking at this, which is the average number of candidate moves for E4 and knight F3 in both. And we see on the right in no-castling chess that there are many more options per move that are plausible according to AlphaZero after E4. Obviously, many more are also plausible, but AlphaZero has very strong opinions, very strong preferences. So, you know, you should multiply these numbers by some human factor. Comparing different variants all together, and these are two separate plots as to whether variants are a subset or a superset of what classical chess is. We see equally with the same interpretation of everything that stood right being more diverse, more flexible, more rich. That pawn sideways chess, for instance, adds quite a number of different options and differences to classical chess. So it's very different and very rich. And torpedo, semi-torpedo, all of them basically add something interesting. And on the other hand, we have a comparison against two classical chess with respect to variants that are subsets of it, like pawn one square. And we see that it also adds a lot of flexibility and quite a big difference to how the game is played under classical rules. Finally, in terms of quantities, and then I will move on to some examples, we've done an evaluation of what the respective piece value was in the games that AlphaZero has played in 1 second per move. So this is a somewhat biased set of games. These are not the exact precise human values as they would be, but they're an approximation. And the reason why we've looked at this is that, you know, as a beginner, when you start playing the game of chess, you need to learn about material first, because there will be exchanges on the board. You need to know which exchanges are favorable, what you should be doing or not doing. And once you start adding options or removing options, the relative values of pieces change. So this is to inform starting players as to what is okay to do in a practical game. And we see in particular, as you add mobility to the pawns, so semi-torpedo, torpedo, pawn sideways, pawn back, that the relative value of pawns increases. So the relative value of all of the other pieces expressed in centi-pawn values decreases. And in pawn sideways chess in particular, it is better to have two pawns than a minor piece. And AlphaZero indeed often makes these sacrifices. I mean, as we are, you know, prone to seeing it from the classical perspective, where it acquires two pawns for a piece and then, you know, pushes for a win with that kind of material exchange. So this was interesting, and it's just there to inform, you know, players. And I'm just going to go into, if we have the time, maybe do we have the time? I should probably stop. But anyway, if we do have the time in the end, we can revisit. I've included some example games from two of these variants as video clips. But I think, given time, we should stop here and maybe go there in the end after them and after the questions, time permitting. So I'm gonna stop here then instead.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Ullrich and Nenad. I just want to say that we're never going to have enough time to discuss all of the issues that arise here. So at the conference, we do have this kind of virtual coffee break area, and I put a link in the chat. So you can pop over there afterwards and continue the discussions. In the meantime, I'd like to share with you kind of a development of this. It was an implementation of some of these chess variations, which was done by chess.com. And so Mike Klein has contributed a small kind of a video on this. So if I could play this out, and then at the end we can come back and wrap up.
Thank you for allowing me to present on variance. My name is Mike Klein, and I don't know if I can get to talk about chess.com instead of Chesskid, but I'm very happy because my regular chess rating plateaued a long time ago. And so all I do now is try to get better at variance. So this is the new variance site. If you go to chess.com/variance, I know, crazy URL, right? You will see all of the variants that I see on the right. I'll be honest with you, 4-player chess is not one that I have a lot of familiarity with. It's a little bit like Risk, though, in that you could have 2 or 3 people team up on the 4th one, and you could lose through no fault of your own. So don't make other chess players mad. Now, Bughouse needs no introduction. You can actually play Bughouse on the regular chess.com live server, but you can also play it over here. You can see by the number of players, it's one of the most popular. If you've never played Bughouse before, frankly, I don't know where you've been. No explanation needed. Fog of War is the big new rage, and I love it. If I click on Fog of War, you kind of get the gist. You are only able to see your army. Now, you can also see pieces that you are aiming at of your opponent, and of course, the computer will not let you make an illegal move. So for example, one idea is to fianchetto a bishop very early because you'll be able to see exactly what your opponent has on that long diagonal. After a couple of games, you'll pick up on some tricks. For example, you don't see knight captures coming, so knights are incredibly important. Also, a queen can always see a capture coming except from a knight. So it's a little bit weird, and it's probably one of the best games for making big upsets. So you can defeat Magnus if he puts his king on a square that's unknowingly in danger. Actually, if I come over here to the watch panel, I'll actually click on, here's a game. We're actually watching this game from the black perspective, and you can see black is only able to see pieces that he is aiming at. Now, after black makes a move, the watch panel will automatically switch to the white perspective. So one funny problem of Fog of War, and I know this because I tried to stream it the other day. If you're trying to stream Fog of War on your Twitch or your YouTube channel, well, your opponent could actually go into the server and see exactly what you see. See how it just flipped there? So we haven't quite figured out a way to stream Fog of War, except if you have your stream on a delay. Okay, anyway, that's not so important. But now if I go back to this, next one is called Automate. This one is fascinating. You basically get a certain bank of pieces based on point value. So you can't just have 15 queens on the chessboard. You set up your starting position, and then your opponent does too, and the computer plays it out. I have no idea what the dominant strategy is with Automate. If you want a lot of minor pieces or a few queens or whatever. I've only played it once or twice, but I can't really offer you any insight into how to play Automate well. Okay, let me go back here. Horde is absolutely fascinating. You are looking at the starting position on the screen right now. It is, what is that? 8, 16, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36 pawns. I have that right? Okay, 36 pawns against an army, a normal army. And if you checkmate black, you win. Or if black captures all of your pawns, then black wins. Now, one interesting idea, and pretty much the only way to win as black, is to get your queen behind all of the pawns where they can't guard each other. And if you sneak behind enemy lines, you can usually capture them all. So I've had wins as white and wins as black. I suspect that it is a forced win for one side or the other. I just don't know which one. Atomic is a long time internet chess game. If you capture a piece, you blow up all of the adjacent squares. So for example, if you get your bishop to c4 and you take on f7, you win right away because you blow up the king since the king is adjacent to f7. Yeah, it's crazy. And there's people much better than me because it's been around for a long time. Chaturanga is the original predecessor of chess. You can see we've got elephants and different implements of the 5th century there on the screen. And if you'll remember the way pieces moved, you know, you could only move, I think, queens 1 square diagonal or all of that stuff. I mean, you can look up Chaturanga. I don't usually play it, but yeah, it's the old rules of chess. Why not give it a try? Okay, one of my personal favorites is giveaway. And one big question with variants is, do they provide any chess value? I think generally no, or certainly if you're going to spend an hour doing chess, doing regular chess does more for you than variants. However, we all need to let our hair down a little bit. There is one way that I can suggest that giveaway could possibly help you, in that when it's your turn and you're aiming at a piece, the rules say you have to capture. Now, if you're aiming at multiple pieces, you get to choose which one to capture. However, unlike regular chess, you can really string together a forced series of moves, because you can make one of your opponent's pieces capture pretty much your entire army. In fact, this, I believe, has been solved by computers, and white is winning, but no human can possibly memorize all of the possibilities. So, for example, I'm going to let you guys work this out, but if white plays e3, I have personally analyzed knight a6 to be a losing move. Now, our bishop must take the knight, the pawn takes back, and then the worst piece in giveaway is the bishop, because it has just enough power to cross the board, but it can't often give itself away because it can only travel on one color. So going back to my refutation, if you want to call it that, e3, knight a6, bishop takes a6 forced, b takes a6, queen e2. And white is going to take the a6 pawn on the next turn, bring the bishop out, and then you can play king f1 because you have to give away your king in this game. And well, the bishop goes wild. We call it a crazy bishop, and it's actually a forced win. So I'll let you work it out. But I love it because you really can, I don't know, you can plan out many, many moves in a row. So it's sometimes called take me, and there's different variations like loser's chess. But in our variation, you do have to give away the king. The king has no special value. Capture anything. Well, this one's a lot like regular chess, except you can capture your own pieces. It even means that you're not often checkmated when you think you are. Like, for example, if I do the 4-move checkmate, it's not checkmate because the black king could capture one of his own pieces to get out of danger. Okay, but it does resemble a lot of real chess. And occasionally you're going to want to capture one of your own pawns to open a file. Perfectly possible strategy. Sideways pawns, I have never played. Pawns can move sideways 1 square. So take that for what it is. So you're not always going up the elevator. Sometimes you're going up the stairs. So King of the Hill also exists on our main server. It's regular chess. You can win the game by checkmate, or if you safely get your king to one of those 4 center squares, that is the other way to win. The key thing here is, when do I bring my king out? If you do it too early, he'll get pushed back. He'll get checked backward. But you often don't want to castle because you're bringing your king away from the goal. So 3 check is my other personal favorite. It also exists on our live server. If you give 3 checks, you win the game. Very simple. There are tons of openings involved, and I've actually played a couple of matches online. Got kind of humiliated by Jan Ludwig Hammer, but I promise I did okay against him in real life. But when push came to shove and we played on a public match online, no contest for me. I will say that I was given a secret training match by MVL. Shout out to Maxime for trying to help me, but it didn't do any good. Anyway, 3 check, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's great. I've written some articles on 3 check strategy on my blog on chess.com. Torpedo, pawns can move forward 1 or 2 squares at any time. So kind of like sideways pawns, but the adjustment of pawns being able to move 2 squares, I imagine that makes endgames crazy. Haven't played it yet, but it looks interesting. Blindfold, well, you guys know what blindfold chess is. You simply can't see the movements of the pieces. You can only see square highlights of where you move and where your opponent moves. And then we get to no castling. Probably we owe Kramnik a couple bucks for this, but I don't think Kramnik invented it, but he's trying to popularize it. It's regular chess without castling. So that's it. This one obviously is the most resembling of regular chess. And in fact, it could end up being regular chess if you try to castle by hand, but it does get very interesting, leaving the king in the middle of the action. So there you go. We're actually hoping a lot more people play on our variant server, because in case you haven't noticed, there's a bit of a spike right now, thanks to a particular Netflix TV series. Our live server is holding up, but man, we are seeing about the outer edges of what we're capable of. So our live server team is doing fantastic, but this is in a different server. So we're hoping even more people play chess.com/variants. You're going to find me here a lot. I quite love most of these games. And yeah, it's just a good way of staying active in the game that we all like when you're tired of getting beat by grandmasters on the regular game that we've all been studying. So thanks a lot. And I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but it was nice being able to show this off for you.
Okay, well, we've had 3 very intense presentations. We've probably only got room for about 2 questions before I have to close, because I have to close before the next session. So any questions that, Ullrich, that you've seen in the chat that you might wish to respond to briefly?
There were so many, but I noticed a comment on Nigel Short and Stalemate. What we found from AlphaZero is that it would just find ways to avoid positions in which it could possibly be stalemated. So the kinds of endgames that you run into are different, and you'd find a lot more games in which you would draw by 3-fold repetition, for instance. And it was quite surprising that the impact on chess wasn't as big on the actual win draw loss rate. It wasn't as big as we thought before we started.
Okay, and Nenad, do you have any questions that you can pick up there?
Yeah, well, one that obviously, as Ullrich says, I mean, there are plenty. So if we can, pick this up later, it would be great. But one that kind of stuck with him was, can a chess player strengthen their normal chess if they study the variations like, torpedo, pawn backwards, and the others? And I think that's essentially what we're also hinting at the paper, at least Vladimir Kramnik is, in terms of his opinion on the potential value of all this. Obviously, as any variant is yet another game, yet another thing you can play and enjoy. But particular variants emphasize different aspects of the game. And this can be, pedagogically speaking, with learning how to play chess and trying to improve, because for instance, the slower variations or pawn 1 square, where there is a lot of flexibility around the pawn structure and so on, can be quite, let's say, good for trying to decide on which one you assume. So learning about pawn structures. Obviously, games like pawn backwards and pawn sideways, because the pawn structure is now flexible, no longer static, need to be much more about dynamic piece play. And pawns are very important, they're relevant, but it's not about pawn weaknesses, and it's about other more concrete things. Torpedo, it's very aggressive. The endgames are fast. It's hard to just take a glance at the board and know what is happening. You need to calculate move by move often to discern the truth of the position. So I think that they pose different challenges for players. And as such, if you try playing them, you will find out that by having played them, it will improve different areas of your game.
Thank you, Nenad. So I'm going to bring this to a close now. There is another session at 3 o'clock GMT on artificial intelligence meets big data. So for those of you interested in this, you can come along later. And in the meantime, we have a cafe to which I've placed a link in the chat. So thank you very much, everybody, for Ullrich and Nenad for speaking and for attending the event. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, John.